Hey everyone, thanks for checking out part 1 of my PlayStation 1 retrospective. This time I'm going through the launch year. I'm just going to go through the couple titles from that year worth noting and talking about the original PlayStation, which I've got right here. You can see the controller is the old non-DualShock controller. It's the original release, the gray one. Let's get right into it. At the time, the PlayStation really seemed to come out of nowhere. It wasn't until way later that we found out that Sony and Nintendo had been working on a CD Super Nintendo, and that fell through, and the remains of that ended up forming what would eventually become the Sony PlayStation. It was released on September 9th of 1995, almost a year after its Japanese release, and even though Sony didn't really have a whole bunch of development history, they lined up some pretty big developers like Namco to help them through the launch years. It had a lot going against it at the time for the consumer market because it was a pretty expensive system. It was also the first system that didn't launch with a pack-in game, so you had to buy your games separately. And it was the first system that required memory cards, so you could save your data. So that was a pretty big deal. It's just a lot of additional costs that people didn't expect at the time. But because they had a bunch of good software libraries that they shared with developers to help with their game development, the system was well liked by developers and became the fastest selling system at the time. The decision not to go with carts and go with CDs instead really helped them steal a lot of Nintendo's third parties, because cartridges were really limited and the N64 couldn't hold a lot of data on each cart, but CDs could hold so much more, and developers were really looking to push that stuff with new 3D technology, FMVs and all that stuff, good CD quality audio, and you really couldn't achieve that on other systems. Getting into the games, we had 3 different kind of cases over the span of the library. I think originally we had Sega Saturn's like plastic cases that were big and broke really easily. Then they transitioned to these kind of more cardboard cases that were sturdy but about that same shape, and eventually they moved to the regular jewel case like games. So a bunch of different display formats if you're looking at collecting a PlayStation library. If you haven't seen one of my retrospectives before, what I like to do is go through my library. This gives me a good opportunity to see what games I maybe don't want to hold on to and what new games I need to pick out that I didn't know before. I go through every year in release order, every notable game or games that I think are notable and worth checking out or knowing about, so that you can kind of build your own library from there or just discover a bunch of games maybe you didn't know about. The system launched in September of 1995, so we've only got 4 months, but there were still a bunch of great titles that came out in that time. The PlayStation launched with 10 different games, but only a couple really notable launch titles at this point. Starting off with Battle Arena Toshinden, which was the first notable anime-style 3D fighter. Unlike other 3D fighters at the time, the game focused on anime-style characters with quick movements and floaty jumping, so nothing like the more realistic movements of games like Virtua Fighter. The next launch game I want to discuss is one I'm always looking out for. I have the import title but would love to grab the one that was released over here, and that is the Raiden Project. This is a compilation of Raiden 1 and 2. Those are arcade shoot-'em-ups that are just really fun vertical shoot-'em-ups that have a bit of horizontal scrolling to enhance the play field. This game features the original or rearranged soundtracks, and it can use horizontal mode if you want to flip your TV on its side. A really big title at the time for the system was Ridge Racer. This is kind of the beginning of the console ports of Namco's Arcade Racer that was kind of synonymous with the PS1 era. I'm not going to mention every Ridge Racer game, so just be aware that there are multiple others in the series that you can look up if you want to check out the whole series. Other launch titles included Extreme 1, well this was actually called ESPN Extreme Games, but they changed that name later. Killick, the DNA Imperative, an update of NBA Jam, the Tournament Edition, Power Surf 3D Tennis, and Total Eclipse Turbo. 2 launch titles that I'm sure we'll get to when we do the multi-platform videos, but they weren't exclusive to the PlayStation, were Rayman and Street Fighter the Movie. So just a week after launch, we get another big game for the PS1, that is Air Combat. So this is the beginning of the console version of Namco's big arcadey combat flight sim series. It kicks off the Ace Combat series and was a huge hit at the time. Right after that, a personal pick for myself, Cyber Sled. This one is just an arcade game that I used to love as a kid. So it was kind of a simpler version of Virtual-On where you controlled 2 tanks instead of mechs, and it had a similar 2-joystick movement style. It was just a ton of fun. It's a blast 2 players, and this is the only console port. Right after that in October, a really rare game and one I've been meaning to pick up but is actually tough to get a hold of. That is XCOM UFO Defense. This is a port of the PC tactical strategy game, or XCOM Enemy Unknown, and it's the first game in the XCOM series, which was well regarded even before its reboot. Kicking off November, we get Jumping Flash, which is a very early 3D platformer that uses a really unique first-person perspective. In the game, the player controls a robotic rabbit that moves around the environment, collecting 4 jet pods in each stage. The player can also shoot projectiles to take out enemies, and it's just an early attempt at a 3D platformer that doesn't quite hold up, but was really cool for the time. Another huge PlayStation series launches right after that, Twisted Metal. This game kicked off a whole genre. If you haven't played Twisted Metal, it's a mashup of a racing and arena shooter game. It started off that vehicular arena combat game with 12 different crazy characters and vehicles. The game has 6 arenas and can be played either single player or in co-op mode. Finally, the first game in my collection, or rather I should say Michelle's collection, since Tekken is really her thing. But yeah, the original release of Tekken in its big plastic box. It was later released in a smaller case, so a lot of people probably have that version if they're into the series. Tekken is a 3D fighter that would spawn one of the biggest fighting franchises to date. The first game is really rough. The graphics are much closer to Virtua Fighter and there's way fewer characters, but it still lays the groundwork for what's to come in the series. Next up is Warhawk, which is a pretty good futuristic arcadey air combat game. The futuristic setting and ships make the game stand out from other flight sim games. It feels a lot more sci-fi, but really not a great game to play now, just really notable for the follow-up that would come later on PS3. Following that, one of my favorite games to play during the first year of this console, Demolition Derby. This series has basically faded into obscurity now with its later entries, but the first game was amazing for the time. It was a really interesting take on the racing genre. It added Demolition Derby's elements to that gameplay, and it had various modes, including a derby mode that has players trying to win by wrecking each other's cars in a large open arena, a typical racing mode, and a mode that scores the player based on their race position and how many cars they took out during that race. A big thing in the game was that damage on your car would affect the performance of it, depending on the location and degree of the damage on your car. Next up, the only game in my PS1 collection that I don't have the original case for, but one I should track down, I've just never really seen it in the wild, that is Terry Pratchett's Discworld. This is a point-and-click adventure, a really cool animated one based on Terry Pratchett's Discworld novel series. For fans of the novels, it's a great version of that game world. The game stars the recurring character Rincewind, who was introduced in the first books, and takes elements from the novel to tell a new story where he takes on a dragon terrorizing the city. Just a great game for both fans of Discworld and adventure games. After that, the PlayStation gets its version of Doom. This is a port of the PC version, but it also includes all the stages from Doom 2 and Doom Master levels, making it a huge package for Doom fans at the time. Next up was Lemmings 3D, which was surprisingly a decent attempt to take the 2D puzzle game into a 3D style. The gameplay is similar to the previous games in concept, but a player can move the camera around the environment as they assign commands to their lemmings to help them get through each stage. The last game for the year, and one of my favorites, is Wipeout. Now, I know I have a bunch of other stuff on this table, but that's for next year's video, which I'll get to right after this. I just couldn't only have like 3 games on the table. So Wipeout is the start of the futuristic 3D racing series that's fun, fast-paced, just a great racing game still to this day, and definitely a good start for the series. In some cases, they put these slipcases over top. I'm not sure how many games did that, but I'm guessing that's to match what the original artwork looked like when it was a plastic box. So in December of 1995, the last notable game for that year, Loaded, which was a simple but really fun top-down shooter for the time. It had a very unique style where the players could choose from 6 crazy characters, and it had a 2-player co-op mode, which is what really made the game worthwhile. That's it for the launch here of the PlayStation. I'm going to get to all of these games next, so subscribe and stay tuned for more retrospectives. I'll see you guys next time. Bye!